Bismillah, with the name of Allah, walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, and all praise belongs to Allah, Lord of all the worlds. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashraf al-anbiya khatam al-nabiyeen, and may the peace and salutations be upon the leader of the prophets, the seal of them, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala, and upon his family and his companions and all those that follow him. Amma ba'd, to proceed. So in today's episode, again, we have with us our guest speaker from the United States, our Shaykh Umar Quinn, Hafidahullah, may Allah preserve him. And he spent a good 2 weeks here with us. Alhamdulillah, all praises due to Allah, benefiting us with various topics. And today, in today's podcast episode, we want to talk about Islam and Western culture. So we're tackling some issues in regard to what is the difference between how Islam or what Islam teaches with regard to what is considered Western culture today. Of course, Western culture is a very broad term, a broad idea, if you will, because what could be considered Western culture is a number of things. The fact is that the culture in the societies today, in the West especially, has evolved to the point where it's kind of over-accommodating, I think we would say, in Islam, to the point that it changes drastically a lot. And it compromises where a lot of religious beliefs are concerned. So even fundamental Christian beliefs or core Christian values, universal values that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago were commonplace in a Western society or Western country have now become completely null and void. So we want to talk about the difference between how Islam handles these things versus how Western ideologies handle these things and the societies that we live in here in the West, like in Trinidad and Tobago, the United States and Europe, for example. So my first question, Shaykh, is a lot of people ask here in Trinidad and Tobago, when they see us practicing the way that we do, you know, brothers with their beards and sisters with their hijabs, wearing their nice long flowing garments, covering up, you know, they see the brothers, you know, with their thobes, with our nice gowns and so on. These guys obviously are practicing their religion the best that they can. Why doesn't it allow for you to have a little bit of fun? Because we see, you know, a lot of the society we live in is majority Christian. And we see that a lot of the Christians in society, even though by namesake they're Christian, you know, we see that they don't really hold fast to Christian values. So, you know, on a weekend, here in Trinidad and Tobago, for example, on a weekend, they're in the bar, they're in the club, they might have they have boyfriends and girlfriends, they indulge in alcohol. So why doesn't Islam allow you to have a little bit of fun? You know, Allah is merciful, right? God is a merciful God. So why doesn't Islam give a concession to allow us to have a little bit of fun? And then after that, you know, you could practice your religion, a kind of secular ideal now, you know? So that's my first question. What is your response to that in terms of Islam?
Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. To comment on the first part of, you know, the introduction, what you said about the reality of Western culture and segueing into the question about the Islamic view on happiness, which is what you're asking about, fun and happiness and, you know, simplicity and ease in life and all that sort of thing. Then Western culture generally, by the admission of Western academics, you know, there's, for example, a very famous Princeton academic whose name was Carol Quigley, right? And I mentioned in my book Islamophobia, and I quote him in a few places. And he was actually a teacher, one of the teachers of and mentors of Bill Clinton, the United States president. And he summarized it, and there's a wealth of literature that has, you know, corroborated his summarization as and generally in Western thought from the time of the philosophers, you know, time of Hellenism, up until today, you know, that there's a number of things that we can identify as Western thought, as the underpinnings of Western thought. You know, the first is that there is a truth out there. You know, the long and the short of it is that there is a truth. Nobody really has the truth with them. They have pieces of the truth. Everybody has pieces of the truth, right? So there is no final say about the truth in any matter with any individual person. And so we can arrive at approximations of the truth to get close to the truth by way of debate and way of consultation and discussion. And as soon as that concession is, or as soon as that, no, as soon as that agreement is made about what the truth is, that approximation of truth is reached, it changes again as people have new experiences and as new information is discovered and so on and so forth. So it changes again and again and again, for infinity. So therefore, it's a process of becoming. And this is something you hear today very commonly. We're in a process of becoming our better selves and learning what the truth is by turning inwardly and seeing how we feel. And everybody who has goodwill and sincerity, that by the way that they feel, they can, get closer and closer to the truth. And if truth is the bedrock of culture, and if the truth is unknowable, except by way of the whims of people and what everybody agree upon, and if the majority don't agree upon one aspect of it, or those in authority don't agree with one aspect of it, then it's discarded for a period of time. I mean, anybody can see this as a spacious argument. It's a very weak approach to the truth, and therefore the foundation of Western society has been corroded from the inception, from day one. And so this is why we've seen so many different iterations and versions of Christianity over time. The Romanization of Christianity, in the time of Paul even, and then, Catholicism and Protestantism with all of its different schisms and isms and that sort of thing, up until the secular religions that started about, in the, late 1500s or late 16th century, early 17th century, and that sort of thing up until today, it's this process of becoming. It's this process of becoming, and it's this multiculturalism, and everybody has an element with them, and it's really just based upon intuition, how I feel, how you feel, that sort of thing, and everybody has their own version of the truth, and the truth is unknowable, and this by itself makes Western society unstable as a rule, because anybody who doesn't have conviction and certainty about what the truth is and what right and wrong is and how one ought to be and how things actually are, then they have nothing to build upon. They have nothing to build upon, have nothing to pass on to the next generation of values and virtues that are set in stone. And so that segues into the question, right? The question about happiness, and the Islamic version of happiness, if we will call it that. And, as opposed to this mentality that, the way to have fun and the way to be happy is by inebriating oneself, intoxicating oneself, and all this sort of thing is a very adolescent and juvenile approach. If you was to hear that statement, in our parents' generation, and in our grandparents' generation, they would say this must have been asked by a 16-year-old or a 15-year-old. Right? This isn't, but we see people, that are elderly today that have this party mentality still, that have never grown up, that are still in their salad days in their high school years, and that sort of thing. And this flies in the face of intellect, and just basic common sense and basic logic. Logic dictates that to get the things that you want in life, you have to be future oriented, right? You have to be preparing for the next phase in life. You have to be moving into adulthood. And then as a Muslim, we add the layer to that, preparing for the hereafter, and our connection with, with Allah and our connection with the Creator, right? And what is of a good, for us in this world, and was a good for us in the next, and what is harmful for us in this world was harmful for us in the next. So, this mentality is really what has been identified as the cause of the identity crisis in the West by many Western academics. There are, many academic books that discuss this and flesh this out, the history of this in great detail, that it's actually an intended precipitation of identity crisis, that in order to progress as a society and have this inexorable, unstoppable progress or inevitable progress, that we have to shake the foundations of the previous generations to move to the next iteration of coming closer to, what will make people actually happy. And it's utilitarian, and it's a very atheistic way to look at things. And
I think that's a good way, excellent way of putting it when you mentioned, it's an adolescent type of mentality, and it's unfortunate because we see grown people like you mentioned talking about like if come on, like it's time to move on in life. You reach a bigger age now, it's time to. It's like we make jokes about it in our culture, and we say like they're not done in, they don't want to done. They you pass.
we say in America, getting the band back together.
Yeah, getting the band back together. Yeah, so it's that's right, and as you mentioned that. So we want to talk a little bit more about. I mean, that's it's something that shows that the culture of the West, even though it has this mentality of evolving, and if you look at the ones who are legislative makers, the ones who are making legislation, it's usually politicians, right? And they're from the lowest class of society. It's ajib, it's funny, it's really weird, it's strange, because you find that the average person will tell you that politics is corrupt and politicians are corrupt. But yet you have them constantly legislating, making new laws every day, passing a new bill, coming up with new ideas of what is right and what is wrong in society with no, again, baseless foundations, So again, I want to divert a little bit. I want to talk about some of the other things that, again, I want to clarify for our viewers, especially some of the things that Islam doesn't partake in, that Muslims, I should say, don't partake in. Because again, Islam is perfect. Muslims are not. Islam is perfect. Muslim countries are not. So we often hear the argument, well, they just do that in Saudi Arabia, or they just the other day they had this going on in Egypt, or they had that. That is not a yardstick for what is right in Islam or not. What is correct in Islam is based on, because you mentioned identity crisis. Muslims are going through identity crises as well. There are Muslims all over the world, Muslims especially in the West, who are having this problem of integrating into society because of this identity crisis. But you look, for the most part, those who are upon the way of our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, we call them Salafis, but we're orthodox, if for lack of a better word. The Orthodox Muslims, we know that our style never goes out of style, our look never goes out of look, our mentality never goes out of mentality, our dealings never goes out, so it stays consistent from since 1400 years ago when it was revealed till now. It's the exact same thing. So my next question I want to delve into is music, because you mentioned getting the band back together just as a joke, right? So in Islam, music is haram. Music is impermissible. Okay? Again, we often hear people say in Western society, but music gets you so much closer, to sometimes to spirituality, and it's such a spiritual thing, and and we know in Islam, music evokes emotion, right? And the Quran comes as a way of recitation. Sometimes it sounds musical, although we don't say it's musical, but it gives us a feeling of spirituality, so to speak, that is different to that of music. So some of the scholars even said that music is the Quran of the shaitan, right, of the devil. So why is Islam consider music, even though there's some, because I could understand, right? Some people say, okay, there's gangster rap, there's reggae music, we have some bad reggae music, but we have some music that might be quote unquote soothing to the soul, right? It calms the individual. So why is all music considered impermissible in Islam, and why don't we indulge in it?
Music, repeating, words over and over again in this type of way, the lyrics that are involved, the message that is involved, the effect that it has on the mind, it weakens the mind. It weakens the mind, it weakens the memory, and it is a sugar pill to cover over, certain matters of sadness and sorrow and so on and so forth. We don't have a need for music. We don't have a need for music. There's no need for music, and the harms of it outweigh the benefits. So this could be said about, the previous thing about alcohol and various types of intoxicants and so on and so forth. Same said about music, that music is intoxicating. Music intoxicates the mind, and usually these two things are coupled together with a third thing, which is sexual infidelity, promiscuity, fornication, homosexuality, to the end of it. And the messages that are given by and large, historically, and what is called majun, immoral poetry and music and that sort of thing, are inviting people to things that are unbefitting, things that are harmful. The criticism of some people who don't deserve criticism, the praise of some people who don't deserve praise, the extolling of the rulers, to or the praising of the rulers in a way that is unbefitting, or the criticizing of the rulers in a way that is unbefitting, things that make tahreed, that encourage other people towards violence against their opponents and other cultures or other tribes or families or that sort of thing. And historically, music is usually connected to drinking and intoxicants and revelry and that sort of thing. And Islam is a religion of simplicity and a religion of ease and happiness without need for that. And this, the mafasid, the harms that come, from music and from, the use of musical instruments and that sort of thing, outweigh any benefit that is there,
No,
right?
I think
So just as, a person can say, taking a drink here or there, calms my nerves or makes me brave or something of the sort, we say, yes, that's a benefit, but the harms outweigh the benefits. And in Islam, this is a principle. As anything that the benefit outweighs the harm, and he is permissible or legislated or commanded or encouraged. And everything that the harm outweighs the benefit is the opposite. It's forbidden and it's banned or it's disliked according to the degree of its harm, right?
I mean, and that's the thing. If you look at the core of all these things, alcohol, music, it evokes emotions in people. And again, it boils down to taking them away from the servitude of Allah, their God and Creator, our God, to the servitude of, other than that, to the servitude and the slavery of their selves, of their desires. And at the end of the day, if you look at all the things that, happen, like if you look at crime rates, you look at, people, things that happen in regards to debauchery and different forms of vulgarity and all these different things. The core of it is always, a lot of times, is these two things, music and alcohol. And as a matter of fact, music is at the core of all of them. If you look at, for example, the type of emotions that is invoked, you mentioned repetition and stuff like that. Any one of us who grew up in the West know, especially in our culture here in Trinidad and Tobago, you hear a song, sometimes you just hear one word, you remember a whole song and it's stuck. So it's a type of programming. It's a type of, and whether or not you admit it or not, you realize that music does a type of slavery upon you. It enslaves you, and then you become and I think, not to get into too much of conspiracy theory and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, a lot of the artists in the world today have come out, a lot of them admitting the fact that, they were parts of certain cults that they used music to control the masses of the people and so on and so forth. So that's why you have jingles, for example, when you get advertising. And I mean, this topic is a broad topic, but Islam comes to stop all these things. Islam comes to prevent people from worshiping the creation into worshiping the Creator. And any door that we could close from that, I think we have that principle in Islam as well. Closing the doors for that type of servitude, from the servitude of the creation to the servitude to bring back to the servitude of the Creator. That's the mission of Islam, if you will, for a better way of putting it. So, let's move on to the next topic we want to talk about. And it kind of of course, each one leads into the other, right? We want to talk about, again, I think this one is the elephant in the room. Because just recently I had my kids, in a camp here in Tobago, and this issue came up with somebody, the other kids talking to, it was, a non-Muslim, a camp for Muslims and non-Muslims, of course. And they were asking my daughters, how do you guys meet someone to get married to if you don't date? There's no free mixing of the sexes. As a matter of fact, Islam doesn't even allow for the man and the woman to touch. As our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, says, he says the man and the woman, the Prophet ﷺ himself never touched a non-family member woman himself. So, and because these things invoke a type of sexuality, we could all attest to that. Those of us who grew up in the West, we know that. So, if we're not mixing with the other sex and we're not having that sort of interaction with the opposite sex and gender, how is it that we meet women, and how do we meet men, for example? How do we get married, and how does Islam go about doing that? Is that something that can you elaborate a bit on it?
There's a myth that love is something that arises from superficiality, just outward appearances and that sort of thing. And that love is something that comes just intuitionally, that you just have a feeling about a person.
Yeah, love at first sight.
Love at first sight. And the scholars have discussed this in great detail. Ibn Hazm has a book, Tawq al-Hamama, and this has been talked about in great detail, this notion of romanticism. And it does exist. It does exist, right? But to say that all love is like that is a fallacy. It's a fallacy, right? And Ibn Hazm himself and Ibn Qayyim in his book, Rawdat al-Muhibbin, discusses that in great detail. Um, that some people are quick to love and they're quick to fall in love and quick to fall out of love. Some people are slow to fall in love, but yet they build a family together to the end of it, right? So love has its causes, that there is a natural affinity between people, that there's a shared commonality, that they like the way each other look and they like the personalities of each other. They like the personalities of each other. This is a very simple recipe, and at the head of the personality is a person's religious beliefs and their attitude towards religion and that sort of thing. So when we look at this general simple recipe of love, right? Then as Muslims, we raise our children to be marriageable, to have, to care about their appearance, to care about the functioning of the house, right? To care about the aesthetics of the house and the, for men, the ability to earn and provide for family, and to have the grit and resilience that's needed to face the challenges that are going to come in adulthood. We prepare, as we talked about, adolescence, and this is at the core of Western society, especially in today's world. That adolescence is focused upon and was really invented, around 150 years ago as a concept, and adulthood was kind of, went away from and tossed aside, right? To look at how to raise our children to be marriageable and to be prepared for the challenges of adulthood, and to go through, to have the skills and the virtues and the values that are necessary to face the hardships of life, that make a family cemented together and give people longevity in their relationship, and for people to know the rights of each other, through the teachings of the religion, right? These things have been focused on in great detail, more than any other religion, and by far, beyond what's in any other religion. And so, you find a person outside of that their sexual relationships are purely transactional. They're purely transactional. There's no unspoken contract, even let alone a written contract between them about the expectations that they have from each other and the rights that are binding upon one another and that sort of thing. And for that reason, we find the erosion of the family structure. And we find that this has come for generations from the top echelons of society, right? This non-judgmentalism, and that, sow your royal oats and, go and, live, your wildest, fantasies. And then, once you reach your late 20s or mid 30s, then settle down with some poor unsuspecting person who, didn't know what you went through or has a similar background, who, doesn't have, who's not ready for marriage and not ready for parenthood and so on and so forth. And, we see the effects of this at the bottom echelons of society. We see the effects of this in the street culture and the drug culture and the gang culture and all these sorts of things. And it's a very selfish way to approach looking at starting a family and starting the next generation and that sort of thing. And the effects of that are obvious to anybody who will take the blinders off and take, the horse blinders off and the rose-colored glasses and just look at it for what it is. Just look at it for what it is. So, the way that Muslims go about, courting and, introducing suitors to their daughters and vetting people who are suitable for marriage and that sort of thing. There's no forced marriage in Islam, right? And at the age of puberty, when a child reaches the age of puberty by way of a menstrual cycle, which is the traditional age of marriage, across cultures historically, right? And that sort of thing, we find that even in the past, people were much more prepared for adulthood at an early age than people who are well into their 30s and 40s today, who are like little children. You find grown men still spending you know, 6, 7, 8 hours a day playing video games, you know, that sort of thing. You know, it's like, you know, it's just like I said, you know, it's this adolescent, juvenile approach and mentality, and it's a culture of juvenility, is what it is, you know. And so, alhamdulillah, the long and the short of it is that, you know, we ready them for marriage by way of passing on values that are prized in Islam, and by way of example as parents, by way of example as parents, and showing what a loving household is. And it's something that comes natural. And, you know, coming into Islam myself in my late teens, you know, I was around a lot of people who came from, you know, Egypt or Iraq or other countries who were cab drivers and who had families in the States and families back home, you know, and they were supporting even their children and their children's spouses when the economy had failed in certain Muslim countries, just driving cabs. And I remember somebody telling me, like, why don't I get married? And I was very young. I think I was 18 at the time. And I said, I can't afford to get married. You know, my job doesn't, I was a janitor at the time. I couldn't afford to get married. I said, and he said, it's a shame. He said, you're a U.S. citizen. You have, you know, all of the opportunities in front of you. You could easily afford to be married, right? But you just convince yourself otherwise. True. You convince yourself otherwise, right? Yeah. So, you know, at the end of the day, you know, when we look at just the mentality that is taken towards starting a future and having a wife and what is required, the simplicity that is found in Islam and even in other cultures traditionally, historically, as compared to this type of mentality, then it's a start and stop. It's a they call it the dating and rating game, right? It's, you know, it's a dating game. It's like you date somebody, you know, and just on impulse and intuition, did you like, you know, your initial encounter with them? Perhaps you may have, you know, even had sexual relations on the first or second or third encounter, that sort of thing. And what we actually find today is that this doesn't liberate people. It actually does the opposite, because statistically, there are more people that are lonely who are having a hard time finding anybody to be an intimate companion with, to spend time with, today than at any other point in the past several decades. Right.
I mean, you know, what amazes me is you hear people say all the time, oh, you know, they're scared of marriage. You know, and you hear, you know, young adults, if you will. As you said, adolescent is a made-up thing now, but you hear people in their 20s or 30s even, and they say, I'm not ready for marriage yet. No, I don't want to settle down. And settling down is this, you know, this great facade that is so scary for them, right? But when you tell them about, you know, dating and having multiple sexual partners, and, oh, that's perfectly fine. That's perfectly fine. And to me, it's so illogical, because, you know, if you want to have a meaningful life, and you want to have, if you have, especially if you have kids, you have, you know, you're a parent and you have kids, and you understand that, you know, what you want for them is to be respectable human beings, somebody that sticks to one person, has a, you know, one, or even if, you know, of course, if it's a woman especially, you know, nowadays we have women that are having, it's become glorified for women to have multiple partners and to have this type of hypersexuality, and that's the next thing. We have a culture today, and it's only Islam that, and I see, if you go back into, you mentioned traditional values, going back historically, we're the only ones that stuck to it. We're the only ones that stuck to the values that were given by all the, you know, faiths that were divinely revealed, whether it's Christianity or Judaism and so on and so forth. People have broken from those traditions, and it has changed drastically throughout the decades, throughout the centuries, right? Because, and you know, and this is the irony of the situation. They say that Muslims are misogynistic. You know, we have a patriarchal mentality in Islam. In fact, it's quite the opposite. We don't consider, you know, men to be in this form of superiority that you, in the way that you consider it. As a matter of fact, you look at some of the men in society today. The reality is, you know, you find, like, okay, in France, for example, with the hijab ban, recently they banned abayas and all this sort of foolishness, you know, big gowns for Muslims. It's almost like you hear them saying, and as ridiculous as this statement sounds right now, I'm going to say it out loud, and you're going to hear how ridiculous it is. It's like, well, how dare you cover yourself up? How dare you not show me what your body looks like? You know, so who's the patriarchal society? Who's the society now that has men like these lustful animals wanting to look at women and find it, you know, ridiculous that you don't allow them to see your body. You know what I mean?
Who's objectifying women?
Who's objectifying women? Exactly. When we're the ones that are saying women should be honored, women should be respected, women should be, respected for their individuality and their mind and for their, and we've done that. They say all kinds of foolishness about Islam. One of the greatest scholars in Islam was the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, Aisha radiallahu anha, may Allah be pleased with her. They say we take a quarter of our religion from her. She's one of the one that narrated the most sayings and narrations from the Prophet, peace be upon her, be upon him. So, I think anybody with any objective mindset will know that it is not. See, that's the adhan now we're having, but its objective is to honor women, honor marriage, honor the society, honor the 5 particular things, which is what I want to kind of do a little closing on here now. What separates the Western society in their secularistic, sometimes capitalistic mindset, where the rich oppress the poor, the strong oppress the weak, these sort of concepts, the Machiavellian concepts. And the viewers could do their research too. You could see anybody who lives in the West knows these concepts exist. Islam is quite different. Islam preserves 5 things, and I want you to elaborate a bit on that for us. Before we speak about that and we close on that, I want to ask you one more question that I think we have to touch on, even though we're a bit over, which is the situation of riba, what we call riba in Arabic, which is interest. Now, interest meaning interest that is accrued through money, usury, you could say, right? Now, if you look at the Bible, just recently, the church only recently made usury permissible. Prior to the 18th century, somewhere about 1750, I think it was considered impermissible according to the church. But somehow they were able to play with words as they do, play with some terminologies, redefine certain things and say, okay, no, it's okay to make... If you look at the incident with Jesus in the Bible where he went into the temple and threw all the tables of the money lenders, what were they doing? They were Jews that were indulging in usury, right? So Islam still holds to the fact that usury. So people often say, well, how do you Muslims survive in a society? How are you going to buy a house without mortgage and interest? How are you going to buy a car without, interest? How do you survive in these type of things? We hold fast to the rule that interest, making money on money, is impermissible. Tell us, how can you tell us why is that still held fast by the Muslims?
When we look at just a couple of 100 years ago in Western society, up until today, then we find that one of the most prized, if not the most prized value in Western society is what they call industriousness. And that especially in America, which is a big laboratory and always has been, that people were tinkerers and inventors and right. And people, a lot of natives were killed along the way, and there's no doubt about that. Yeah. But that they paved their way across the wilderness from sea to shining sea, right, by way of grit and determination, and just pushing forward, and having what they called rugged individualism, right, not today's fragile individualism, yeah, right? And it's rugged individualism. And then it require all of that. Then it require, for a person to make themselves subservient to the bank by way of taking exorbitant amounts of money or loans that had exorbitant interest rates and these sorts of things that are designed to make you beholden to financial institutions, right? That wasn't necessary. And it's still not necessary today. Islam also promotes industriousness. The companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, by way of wise diplomacy and wise trade and business transactions and investment, and giving good loans that didn't, generous loans that didn't have interest connected to them and that sort of thing, and by way of having a partnership that with shared gains and losses and shared risk and that sort of thing, had the most lucrative financial presence on the earth for centuries. Yeah. Right? And so this is a system that they've made for their self, and this is what they've limited their self and limited their minds to believing that it has to be, and this is what has been ingrained and indoctrinated in them. And we see from lived experience that it's not necessary. It's not necessary, that there are alternatives, And there's a lot that can be said along these lines, but it is known and is obvious to anybody that usury and interest on loans is very oppressive to those who have less, to those that are underprivileged, as we would say, right? And it victimizes them, and it does victimize them, and it causes resentment between the classes and all that sort of thing, and it, you know, causes corruption in the society. So, the harms of interest far outweigh any supposed or imagined benefits. And that's a short answer. That's a short answer.
So let me just say, I think we could sum up by saying, if you look at all these things we spoke about today, whether it be usury or interest, whether it be music, whether it be alcoholism and alcohol, whether it be all the different things, free mixing and hypersexuality of the sexes and so on and so forth, it all boils down to control and servitude. And if you look at the difference, because again, statistically, human beings in the Western society and those controlled by the Western culture are unhappy, right? It boils down to that. And whereas you look at Muslims today who try to follow the religion as purely as they can, the ones who, the closer they are proportionately to following Islam the way that they should, are genuinely more content, more satisfied. Why? Because the human being by nature, in his heart of hearts, he wants to be good. He wants to be have justice with all creation, with his creator first of all, and then the creation, with his wife, with her husband, with his children, with the society, with your neighbors, with your employees or your employer. We want to be just as human beings, but the more we darken our hearts with these different forms of control, and that's what it is. It's the higher echelons, as you mentioned, that are trying to control mankind. And there's an element of the devil involved, and the shaitan is involved, right? So it's either you're going to be a slave to shaitan and the devil and his system, or you're going to be a slave to Allah and his system, which is what we as Muslims have contended with. And that is why it's up to you, the viewer. It's up to the people that they understand. We live a pure life. And yes, it's difficult. Yes, it's difficult. A lot of people say, well, I can't live that life, but I like to free up. And there's Trinidadian, right? I go in straight local on right? So it's like, no, I like to free up myself. I like to have a little drink. We can have fun. Allah says in the Quran, He mentions in Surah Al-Qasas, in one of the chapters in the Quran, take your portion of the dunya by the translation of the meaning. Take what is your portion of this world and enjoy. And we've given you from the things of this world. Allah is beautiful and He loves beautiful things by the meaning of it, the Prophet told us. So there's nothing wrong with having nice clothes, nothing wrong with living your life and having a wife and being, having kids that are, an apple of your eye and so on and so forth. But, for the betterment of society and the betterment of your country, we want to live a pure, clean life so that when we go on to the next life, and that is what gives us that stability in this world versus the instability of Western culture. So I just want you to close in closing the last thing that I just mentioned in the previous statement. The 5 things that Islam comes to preserve, which Western culture does not. And Western culture is always changing, the things. And basically what they come to preserve is the hierarchy of society. Let's just be real about it, right? Preserve the rich, preserve the capitalistic mentality. Islam, however, preserves 5 things. And if you find that if it's kept and it's upheld in every society, that society will be pure, that society will be upright, unoppressive, and just. Tell us about those 5 things in closing before we close off today.
A general principle in Islam is that Allah revealed guidance and revelation to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to remove people from being the slaves of their desires to being the loving servants of the Creator, right? And this is a principle that has been elaborated upon in great detail by some of the best of the scholars in Islam. And this is something that, when explained, that it is explained that this was a universal, right? From those who explain this, and we'll talk about this in tonight's lecture here at the masjid, was Ash-Shatibi, Abu Ishaq Ash-Shatibi, rahimahullah ta'ala. And when he explained this, he talked about the scriptural evidence and the logical evidence. He said from the logical evidence is that this is a constant and a universal across time and place in societies, that the success and the stability and the safety and the guidance and prosperity of a community and is dependent upon the delayment of gratification, being future oriented, and sacrificing now to enjoy yourself later, and that sort of concept. And this is something that, and it should go without saying, it's something that is at the core of logic and common sense. And when we look at how this cult of the self and focus on the self ascended over the last few hundred years in the West, and how it became the focal point instead of looking upward and outward for one's identity, and looking towards one's religious beliefs and their connection to the hereafter and preparing for it, and their connection with their creator and their role in society as a member of society, their role in even political affairs, or their role in the household and that sort of thing. I need to downward worldly orientation and an inward orientation towards the source of truth being your feelings and your intuition and your gut feeling and your emotions about any particular given issue, and how this coincided with the spread of technology and certain advancements in science and physics and so on and so forth, and the globalization of this culture of the self, this culture and this focus upon the self. And this became the underpinnings, therefore, of governance. And it became the underpinnings of the education system and how we prepare the next generation. And it's at the core of liberalism and the core of the therapeutic culture. And it this combination of the cult of the self and the focus on the inward dimension and what makes me happy in an immediate sense and my creature comforts and the accumulation of wealth, and a selfish, individualistic, mentality and approach to things, as opposed to how things traditionally always were. To have a communitarian, a community focused, family focused, approach to life and identity, that you are identified by your virtues and your character, and that's who you are as a person, and that is the characteristics of your soul and what makes you you. Then what has come as a combination of these two things, of the rise of technology and the focus on material science, I need to give people a higher degree of the standards of living and creature comforts and so on and so forth, and to make that the main focus of governance and education and everything in culture, right? Then what has resulted from that, by the findings of a cadre of Western academics and ethicists, that have documented this meticulously, is a loss of natural freedom. A loss of natural freedom, where people become subservient to machinery, people become subservient to the levers of governance and so on and so forth, and they become beholden to overarching bureaucracies, whether that be educational bureaucracies or governmental bureaucracies or anything of the sort. And the connection and the involvement, the connection of a person to his community, his involvement in his community, his actual care or her care about their community becomes lessened. It becomes lessened. And those things that are constants, because the 5 things that you mentioned are not just restricted to Islam, but every religious community, the scholars explain. Yani they valued these things, and they gave the highest priority to these things to remove detriment to the society, to remove detriment from the society. And they are the preservation of religion, firstly, which is one's beliefs, their corpus of scripture, right? What they held fast to of scripture. In Islam, we have the Quran and the Sunnah that has been safeguarded and protected from the time of the Prophet ﷺ till today, which is by itself one of the greatest miracles of Islam and indicators of the Prophet of Muhammad ﷺ being a true prophethood and the true prophethood. The safeguarding of scripture and the approach, what's called the hermeneutics of the culture, the how to interpret that culture, or the how to interpret the text, which is the core of the culture, right? Religious belief, what those beliefs are, that are read from the text and interpreted from the text, preservation of worship, preservation of general rights of people and roles in society. All this is part of the first aspect, which is preservation of the religion itself. And then, in order for religion to be safeguarded and protected, which contains all the solutions of problems, people have to have their wits about themselves. They can't be intoxicated. Their minds can't be preoccupied with frivolity and so on and so forth. There's a degree of fun that can be had and amusement and joy that can be had in healthy, wholesome ways, of relaxing and letting down one's hair and kicking their feet up and so on and so forth. And this is anybody who's traveled the Muslim world and is familiar with Muslims knows that the Muslims are the experts of chillaxation. Right? There's nobody on the face of the earth who can relax and just be lighthearted. And then we find even with our ulama, even with our scholars, and even with elder scholars, they're the funniest people. Right? They have great senses of healthy humor and so on and so forth. It doesn't require lying or exaggeration or obscenity and vulgarity and so on and so forth. It's a very healthy, society. So the second thing is the intellect, right? The intellect, and strengthening the intellect with beneficial knowledge, and including this is, taking advantage of the shared wealth of humanity in the sciences, and technology and all these sorts of things, and using them for their proper ends, and using these worldly things that Allah has placed at our disposal to establish ourselves upon stability and our societies upon stability, and establish our religion for the sake of our hereafter, right? And so the intellect is safeguarded by way of the prohibition of a number of things like, false entertainment, frivolity that is blameworthy, um, uh, intoxicants, drugs, alcohol, all of these sorts of things, and it is strengthened by way of knowledge and, everything that is quite obvious that is necessary to strengthen the intellect, right? The third thing is the preservation of life. It's technically the second thing. Life, and it comes after religion. So life comes after religion. The preservation of life, and the prohibition of murder, and the limiting of capital punishment to certain specific instances, to the point that the Prophet ﷺ, he said, or was attributed to him that he said, and it is accepted by the scholars that this is a principle in the religion, dar'u al-hudud bishubuhat, that if there's a modicum of doubt in a situation, to not enforce punishments, and to do what is lesser than capital punishment or lesser than any particularly required punishments for certain major infractions or certain crimes that are a detriment to the society. And so the religion comes with some of these punishments to safeguard life, so that corruption isn't spread everywhere, and so that people's property and that their lives are safe. The Prophet ﷺ, when he came with the advent of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula, it was a very dangerous place, and the lands of the Arabs from the Iraq down to the Yemen, and there are many places that were full of highway robbers and thieves and fighting parties and that sort of thing. And by the end of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, peace had spread from border to border without there being a police force, without there being, the raiders like we have today, we call them the rollers. Back home, the people, the SWAT teams kicking in doors and arresting, the criminals and so on. That wasn't necessary, right? It became the cultural norm. It became the cultural norm, and there are certain things that are forbidden religiously, and so they are to be shunned and abandoned and so on and so forth. And people took care of their own affairs and took responsibility for their own communities, right? And so we have now three things: the safeguarding of religion, the safeguarding of life, and the safeguarding of intellect and sanity, right? Fourthly, we have the safeguarding of a nasl, and because if people have religion and they have their sanity and wits about themselves to understand and to implement the teachings of the religion and applying that to their worldly lives in the best way, and their lives are safe and that sort of thing, and their safety and that sort of thing throughout the land, then they need to pass that on to the next generation. They have to pass that on to the next generation. And so a nasl meaning lineage, right? So the safeguarding of lineage, and it is the fourth thing. The fourth thing, and this is an order of importance, right? And so there's great focus that is given on the family structure in Islam, and the ideal family structure for mankind, legislated by the Lord of the heavens and the earth, who knows mankind because he created them and he created their minds, and he knows better than anyone, right? And so once that is put into place, then the last thing is the safeguarding of wealth and property. the safeguarding of wealth and property, and the laws connected to valid and invalid business transactions that are based upon transparency and justice, and the removal of deception and trickery, and the forbiddance of usury and interest, like we talked about earlier, right? And this is the lowest level. Is very important. It's very important, however, and it's not a thing that is denigrated or given little importance, but by giving things their proper importance, focusing most on the religion and the teachings of the religion, and then safeguarding what is necessary for the religion of life and sanity, and focusing on one's family, so on and so forth, then this is the means to establish those ends. Wealth is needed to establish all these things and to have a viable society, have a society that is guided, that is safe, and that is wealthy and prosperous, that has material abundance and their material necessities and needs taken care of. And then it values reputation and honor. Reputation and honor is mentioned as the sixth thing, and there are many things connected to reputation and honor. And generally, what is discussed after these things are what are called tahsiniyat, things that are the ameliorators, that beautify all of this, which are the matters of good character that are necessary to establish guidance, and is necessary to establish safety, necessary to establish prosperity, and which are valuing knowledge and memorization, valuing articulation, valuing the safeguarding of the Arabic language itself, valuing practical virtues connected to courage, connected to forbearance and wise restraint and wise diplomacy, and valuing generosity and being kind to one's guest and being good host and that sort of thing, valuing integrity, valuing truthfulness, and all these sorts of things, are what are necessary to safeguard the society from the bottom to the top, And so there's no doubt that there's much that can be said on the topic, and I thank you, and I ask Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala to reward you and for your invitation here and your generous hosting. And Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala bless you.
Yeah, so obviously we went quite on, and again, I enjoy these conversations so much. I wish we could talk for much longer. I don't think the station is going to give us any much more time, but I just want to say one takeaway, if nothing else, for our viewers to understand that Islam is very intricate. It is very detailed, and it's erroneous to think that our God, our Creator, your God and my God would leave us with anything less than that. He gave us. Yet it's simple. Exactly. It's very simple. But at the same time, it does not leave anything uncovered. It does not leave anything undealt with, if you want to call it that. And therefore, every aspect of our life, there is guidance in it. And our God and our Creator has left guidance for everything for us. So much so that some of the companions used to tell the Prophet ﷺ, they said, the statement, it's not authentic, but I think the meaning of it is correct, that there's not a bird in the sky except that the Prophet taught us something about it. You know what I mean? That flaps its wings except that he taught us something about it. So every minute detail, we have guidance in it. And so I want the viewers to do their own research, be open-minded, have an open heart, look into Islam and understand that the perfection of Islam, the religion that God chose for you and for me, for all of mankind, is the way towards contentment and satisfaction, and the way towards a better life here, in this life and in the next life. So we close with that, and we ask that Allah accept from us this short effort, and we ask that Allah guide you and us to that which He loves and is pleased with. Wa akhir ad-dawana an alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. And the final word is that all praise belongs to Allah, Lord of all the worlds. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala nabiyyina Muhammad.